The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the military checkpoint as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez approached the security gate. His boots echoed against the concrete with the measured pace of someone who had walked these grounds for over 15 years. The base was buzzing with unusual activity. Word had spread that a high-ranking official from the Pentagon was conducting surprise inspections, and everyone was on edge. Marcus had seen it all during his career. He had served 3 tours overseas, earned numerous commendations, and had become known among his peers as someone who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. At 38, his weathered face told stories of desert storms and mountain patrols, but his eyes still held the sharp focus that had kept him and his men alive through countless missions. The inspection team had arrived that morning without warning. Colonel Patricia Hayes, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, led the group. She was known throughout the military for her no-nonsense approach and her ability to spot irregularities that others missed. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went, and today was no exception. Marcus was heading to the armory when he heard his name called over the base's communication system. He was to report to Building C immediately for inspection. This wasn't unusual, as one of the senior non-commissioned officers on base, he was often called upon during official visits. What he didn't expect was what would unfold in the next few hours. The building was a stark, utilitarian structure that housed administrative offices and meeting rooms. As Marcus entered, he noticed several other soldiers already lined up in the hallway, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and concern. The inspection process was thorough, involving everything from uniform checks to personal interviews about base operations. When Marcus's turn came, he was directed into a small room where Colonel Hayes sat behind a metal desk, flanked by 2 junior officers taking notes. The room smelled of disinfectant and had the cold, impersonal feel of countless military facilities he had been in over the years. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes began, consulting the file in front of her. 15 years of service, multiple deployments, exemplary record. She looked up at him with calculating eyes. I'm conducting a comprehensive review of personnel records and conduct. Part of this process involves a complete uniform and personal inspection. Marcus stood at attention, his hands at his sides. He had undergone countless inspections throughout his career and knew the drill. What happened next, however, was unprecedented in his experience. I need you to remove your uniform top for inspection, Colonel Hayes said matter-of-factly. This was unusual but not unheard of during thorough inspections, especially when checking for unauthorized modifications or contraband. Marcus began unbuttoning his uniform shirt, revealing the standard-issue olive green undershirt beneath. But Colonel Hayes wasn't finished. The undershirt as well, Staff Sergeant. This is a complete inspection. A moment of hesitation crossed Marcus's face. In all his years of service, he had never been asked to strip down to this extent during a routine inspection. But orders were orders, and he had learned long ago that questioning superior officers in front of others was not the path to a successful military career. As he pulled the undershirt over his head, the room fell silent. The 2 junior officers stopped writing. Colonel Hayes's pen froze halfway to her notepad. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Across Marcus's broad chest and extending down his left arm was a tattoo that commanded attention not for its artistic merit, but for its significance. The central piece was a detailed rendering of a military unit patch, but not just any unit. This was the insignia of Task Force Obsidian, a classified special operations group that officially didn't exist. The tattoo was masterfully done, with intricate details that spoke of both artistic skill and deep personal meaning. Surrounding the central patch were names, dozens of them inscribed in careful script. These weren't random names, they were the fallen brothers from missions that had never been reported in any newspaper, operations that remained buried in classified files. But it was the additional elements of the tattoo that truly gave the observers pause. Intertwined with the names were coordinates, geographical markers that corresponded to locations where Marcus had operated in some of the most dangerous regions of the world. At the bottom of the design, in bold letters, were the words "Death Before Dishonor" and, below that, a series of numbers that those familiar with military operations would recognize as a classified clearance code. Colonel Hayes had spent 30 years in the military, but she had never seen anything like this. The tattoo wasn't just body art, it was a living document of service in the shadow world of special operations. She recognized some of the names from classified briefings she had attended years ago, operations where the details were so sensitive that even senior officers were only given partial information. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Marcus stood at attention, his expression unchanged, but internally he was calculating the implications of this moment. The tattoo had been his private memorial, his way of carrying his fallen brothers with him wherever he went. He had never intended for it to become a revelation during a routine inspection. One of the junior officers, a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 25, finally broke the silence. "Sir. Colonel, those names." His voice trailed off as Colonel Hayes shot him a warning look. Marcus had gotten the tattoo over several sessions during a period of leave following his return from what was officially listed as a training exercise in Eastern Europe. The reality had been far different. Task Force Obsidian had been tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a hostile zone where conventional military operations couldn't be acknowledged. The mission had gone sideways from the start. What should have been a simple in-and-out operation turned into a 3-day running battle through hostile territory. Of the 12-man team that had been inserted, only Marcus and 3 others had made it to the extraction point. The names on his chest were those of the 8 men who hadn't come home. The tattoo artist, a former military man himself who operated a small shop near Fort Bragg, had understood the significance of what he was creating. He had worked on military tattoos for years, but he had never been asked to create something quite like this. The session had taken place in complete silence, with Marcus providing only the necessary details and the artist working with the reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. Colonel Hayes slowly set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Her mind was racing through the implications of what she was seeing. She had heard whispers about Task Force Obsidian during her tenure at the Pentagon, but, like most officers, she had dismissed them as the kind of rumors that circulated in military circles. Seeing the evidence literally written on the skin of the man standing before her changed everything. The coordinates tattooed on Marcus's arm corresponded to a location in the Balkans where, according to official records, no American forces had ever operated. Yet here was a man standing in front of her with the geographical markers permanently inscribed on his body. The implications were staggering. Marcus could see the recognition dawning in Colonel Hayes's eyes. He knew that she was beginning to understand the true nature of his service, and, with that understanding came a level of respect and caution that he had rarely experienced during routine military interactions. The tattoo also included symbols that only someone with the highest security clearances would recognize. Small icons representing various mission types, duration markers indicating time spent in hostile territories, and coded references to equipment and tactics that were classified at levels far above what most military personnel would ever encounter. As the silence continued, Marcus found himself remembering the day he had decided to get the tattoo. He had been sitting in a hospital bed in Germany, recovering from injuries sustained during the extraction mission. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological weight of losing 8 brothers in a single operation was something that threatened to consume him. The idea had come to him during one of the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. He wanted to carry his fallen comrades with him in a way that honored their sacrifice while keeping their memory alive. The tattoo had become his personal monument to their service and sacrifice. The names weren't randomly placed. Each one was positioned according to the man's role in the unit and the circumstances of his death. The most prominent name belonged to Sergeant Michael "Doc" Patterson, the team's medic who had died while treating wounded civilians caught in the crossfire. His name was placed directly over Marcus's heart, a position of honor that reflected Doc's role as the moral center of the unit. Colonel Hayes finally found her voice. "Staff Sergeant, where did you serve before being assigned to this base?" Her question was carefully neutral, but Marcus could hear the underlying tension. "Various assignments, ma'am. My service record contains the details of my official postings." His response was equally careful. Both of them understood they were navigating dangerous territory. Too much information could compromise ongoing operations, while too little could raise suspicions about the legitimacy of his service. The junior officers were clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. They had expected a routine inspection involving uniform regulations and basic military protocol. Instead, they found themselves witnessing what appeared to be a classified discussion disguised as a personnel review. Marcus's tattoo told a story that officially didn't exist, but the evidence was literally written on his skin. Each element of the design had been carefully chosen to honor specific memories and commemorate particular aspects of his service. The level of detail suggested not just artistic skill, but intimate knowledge of operations that few people were authorized to know about. The room remained silent as Colonel Hayes processed what she was seeing. Her military career had taught her to recognize significant moments, and she understood that this was one of them. The man standing before her represented a level of service and sacrifice that existed in the shadows of conventional military operations. As the silence stretched on, Marcus maintained his position at attention, but his mind wandered to his fallen brothers. He thought about their families, who had been told their loved ones died in training accidents or routine deployments. The official stories were necessary to protect classified operations, but they also meant that the true nature of these men's service and sacrifice would never be publicly acknowledged. The tattoo had become his way of ensuring that their memory lived on, even if their true stories could never be told. Each name represented not just a fallen soldier, but a friend, a brother, someone who had shared the unique bonds that form between men who face death together in service to their country. Colonel Hayes knew she was at a crossroads. The inspection had revealed something far more significant than anyone had expected, and her next actions would determine how this information was handled. She was looking at evidence of operations that existed in the gray areas of military service, where official records were sanitized and true stories remained classified indefinitely. Colonel Hayes dismissed the junior officers with a subtle gesture, leaving only herself and Marcus in the room. The atmosphere shifted immediately as the formality of the inspection gave way to something more personal and dangerous. She had spent enough years in military intelligence to recognize when she had stumbled onto something that required careful handling. "Put your shirt back on, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. Marcus complied, grateful for the opportunity to cover the tattoo that had suddenly become the center of attention. As he buttoned his uniform shirt, Colonel Hayes stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the base where soldiers continued their daily routines, unaware of the revelation that had just occurred in this small room. In 30 years of service, she began, not turning from the window, "I've learned that some stories exist in the spaces between official records. Your tattoo suggests you have quite a story to tell." Her voice carried a mixture of respect and caution that Marcus had rarely heard from superior officers. Marcus remained at attention, uncertain how to respond. The tattoo had always been his private memorial, something he shared only with the tattoo artist who had created it and the occasional fellow special operations veteran who might glimpse it during off-duty moments. Having it examined by a colonel during an official inspection was a scenario he had never anticipated. "Ma'am, I've served where my country needed me to serve," Marcus replied carefully. "My service record reflects my official assignments and commendations." It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged her question while avoiding specifics that could compromise classified operations. Colonel Hayes turned from the window and studied Marcus with new intensity. She had read his official service record before the inspection, noting the gaps and inconsistencies that often appeared in the files of soldiers who had served in special operations. What she hadn't expected was physical evidence of service that went far beyond what was documented in any official capacity. The names on his tattoo had triggered memories from classified briefings she had attended years earlier. Task Force Obsidian had been mentioned in hushed conversations among senior intelligence officers, always in the context of operations that required complete deniability. Seeing those names permanently inscribed on a soldier's body gave weight to rumors she had previously dismissed as military folklore. "The names on your memorial," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Some of them are familiar to me from intelligence briefings. These weren't training accidents, were they?" Her question hung in the air between them, crossing into territory that both of them understood was potentially dangerous. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The conversation was moving into areas where even acknowledging certain facts could violate his security clearances and oath of service. Yet the colonel's question suggested she already knew more than she was letting on, and his silence might be more telling than any words he could speak. "Ma'am, I've lost friends in service to our country. The tattoo helps me remember them." His response was honest while remaining within the bounds of what he could safely acknowledge. The art of speaking truthfully while revealing nothing classified was a skill he had developed over years of debriefings and official inquiries. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, recognizing the careful balance in his words. She had conducted enough classified interviews to understand when someone was being truthful within the constraints of their security obligations. What impressed her was not just what Marcus was saying, but how he was handling a situation that could easily have compromised both of their careers. The coordinates tattooed on his arm had caught her attention for reasons beyond their geographical significance. She had been present during planning sessions for operations in those exact locations, operations that officially never occurred. The precision of the coordinates suggested intimate familiarity with terrain and mission parameters that few people outside the planning committees would possess. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to consider your answer carefully." Colonel Hayes returned to her chair but remained standing behind it, her hands gripped on the back. "Have you ever been contacted by anyone asking about your tattoo or the service it represents?" The question surprised Marcus. In the 3 years since he had gotten the tattoo, no one had ever approached him about it beyond casual inquiries from other veterans. The specificity of the colonel's question suggested she was concerned about something more than simple curiosity about his body art. "No, ma'am. The only people who have seen it are medical personnel during routine examinations and a few fellow veterans during off-duty activities. No one has ever asked me about specific details or shown unusual interest in it." His answer was direct and complete, reflecting his understanding that her question had serious implications. Colonel Hayes felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that Marcus's tattoo hadn't attracted the attention of foreign intelligence services or other hostile actors who might have recognized the significance of what it represented. Concern because she now realized she was looking at a walking security risk that apparently no one in the chain of command had identified or addressed. The tattoo represented a fundamental challenge to operational security protocols. Special operations personnel were trained to maintain cover identities and avoid anything that might compromise their past missions or future operations. Yet here was a highly decorated soldier who had essentially created a permanent record of classified service that he carried with him everywhere. "The reason I ask," Colonel Hayes continued, "is that your tattoo contains information that certain people would find very valuable. Coordinates, unit designations, operational timelines, it's all there for anyone with the knowledge to interpret it." Her voice carried a warning that Marcus was beginning to understand. Marcus had never considered his tattoo from the perspective of operational security. To him, it had been a deeply personal memorial to fallen brothers and a private way of processing trauma from his special operations service. The idea that it could be seen as a security risk or intelligence gold mine had never occurred to him. The realization began to sink in as he thought about the level of detail he had included in the tattoo. The coordinates weren't just general geographical references, they were precise GPS locations of insertion and extraction points. The unit symbols weren't generic military insignia, they were specific task force identifiers that corresponded to highly classified operations. "Ma'am, I never intended for the tattoo to compromise operational security. It was meant as a personal memorial." Marcus's voice carried a note of concern as he began to understand the implications of what Colonel Hayes was suggesting. "I believe that, Staff Sergeant. But intent doesn't change the reality of what you're carrying around on your body." Colonel Hayes moved around the desk and sat down, her expression shifting from interrogator to counselor. "The question now is what we do about it." The options were limited and none of them were appealing. Marcus could be ordered to have the tattoo removed or altered, which would mean destroying the memorial he had created for his fallen brothers. He could be transferred to a position where his tattoo would be less likely to attract attention, effectively ending his career in active operations. Or the situation could be reported up the chain of command, where others would make decisions about how to handle the security implications. Colonel Hayes was facing her own difficult choices. As the inspector who had discovered the potential security risk, she was obligated to report it through appropriate channels. Yet she also recognized that Marcus was a valuable soldier whose service record suggested he could be trusted with sensitive information. The challenge was finding a solution that protected both national security and a soldier who had clearly sacrificed much for his country. "Tell me about the tattoo artist," Colonel Hayes said, shifting the conversation in a new direction. Did he understand what he was creating? Her question revealed another dimension of the security concern: how many other people had detailed knowledge of the tattoo's contents and significance. Marcus thought back to his sessions with Jake Morrison, the former Marine who had operated the tattoo shop near Fort Bragg. Jake had been professional and discreet, asking few questions and working from the detailed sketches that Marcus had provided. But Jake was also an experienced military veteran who would have recognized the significance of what he was being asked to create. The artist is a former Marine with combat experience. He understood the military significance of what he was creating, but I believe he maintained professional discretion about the details. Marcus's answer was carefully considered, reflecting his assessment of Jake's character and professionalism. Colonel Hayes made a note in her file. The tattoo artist represented another potential security concern that would need to be addressed. If Marcus's tattoo contained classified information, then the person who had created it also possessed that information and would need to be evaluated as a potential risk. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. One of the junior officers who had been dismissed earlier poked his head into the room. "Colonel, excuse me, but you're needed for the next phase of the inspection. The base commander is asking for you." Colonel Hayes glanced at her watch and realized that the interview with Marcus had taken much longer than scheduled. The base inspection was supposed to continue with reviews of other departments and personnel, but the discovery of Marcus's tattoo had derailed her planned timeline. "Give me 10 more minutes," she told the officer, who nodded and closed the door behind him. She turned back to Marcus with an expression that suggested their conversation was approaching a critical decision point. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to make a recommendation that may seem unusual, but I believe it's in everyone's best interest." Colonel Hayes leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "I'm going to classify this conversation and the details of what I observed today. No report will be filed, and no further action will be taken regarding your tattoo." Marcus felt a wave of relief, but Colonel Hayes wasn't finished. "However, this comes with conditions. You will limit exposure of the tattoo to essential personnel only. You will report any attempts by unauthorized individuals to photograph or document it. And you will consider carefully whether additional tattoo work might further compromise operational security." The conditions were reasonable and Marcus understood the wisdom behind them. Colonel Hayes was essentially giving him a second chance while establishing protocols to prevent the situation from becoming a larger security issue. It was a solution that protected both his personal memorial and national security interests. "I understand, ma'am, and I appreciate your discretion in handling this matter." Marcus's relief was evident in his voice, but he also understood that this conversation had changed his relationship with his tattoo forever. What had been a purely personal memorial was now something he would need to manage as a security consideration. Colonel Hayes stood and extended her hand to Marcus, a gesture that acknowledged the unusual nature of their interaction and the trust that had developed between them during the conversation. "You're a good soldier, Staff Sergeant. Your service record reflects that, and so does your dedication to honoring your fallen brothers. Just be more careful about how you do it in the future." As Marcus shook her hand, he realized that this encounter had revealed something important about the nature of his service and sacrifice. His tattoo had been created as a private memorial, but its discovery had shown him that even personal expressions of military service carried broader implications for security and operational effectiveness. The colonel's decision to handle the situation discreetly reflected an understanding of the complexities faced by special operations personnel as they tried to process their experiences while maintaining the security requirements of their service. It was a balance that required constant vigilance and careful judgment. As Marcus prepared to leave the room, Colonel Hayes added one final observation. "The men whose names you carry deserved better than to have their service remain in the shadows forever. Your tattoo may not be the appropriate way to honor them, but your dedication to their memory speaks well of your character." 3 days after his encounter with Colonel Hayes, Marcus found himself unable to shake the implications of their conversation. The tattoo that had once been a source of private comfort had become a constant reminder of the delicate balance between personal memory and operational security. He went about his daily duties with his usual efficiency, but his mind kept returning to the names inscribed on his chest and the stories they represented. The first name on his tattoo belonged to Corporal Danny Ghost Martinez, a reconnaissance specialist who had died during the initial phases of the Balkan operation. Danny had been the youngest member of Task Force Obsidian, barely 22 when he volunteered for the unit. He had earned his nickname for his ability to move through hostile territory without being detected, a skill that had saved the team's lives on multiple occasions. Marcus remembered the day Danny joined the unit. He had transferred from the Rangers with a reputation for unconventional thinking and an almost supernatural ability to read terrain. During their first mission together in Afghanistan, Danny had identified an ambush that conventional surveillance had missed, saving the entire team from a coordinated attack by insurgent forces. The operation in the Balkans was supposed to have been Danny's last mission before returning to conventional duties. He had been accepted to officer candidate school and was planning to marry his high school sweetheart when he returned. Instead, he died when his observation post was overrun by hostile forces who had somehow detected his position despite all the precautions he had taken. Marcus had been the one to recover Danny's body, and the memory of that moment was seared into his consciousness. The young soldier had been found still gripping his rifle, having held his position even when retreat might have saved his life. His dedication to the mission and his brothers had cost him everything, but it had also provided the intelligence that allowed the rest of the team to complete their extraction. The second name, Sergeant Michael Doc Patterson, carried even more weight for Marcus. Doc had been the team's medic, but his skills extended far beyond basic field medicine. He was a trained paramedic who had volunteered for special operations because he believed his medical training could save lives in situations where conventional medical support wasn't available. Doc had saved Marcus's life during a firefight in Eastern Europe when shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had severed an artery in his leg. Working under intense enemy fire, Doc had managed to stop the bleeding and stabilize Marcus long enough for the team to reach their extraction point. The medical treatment had been performed in the back of a moving vehicle while hostile forces pursued them through mountain terrain. But Doc's death hadn't come during a combat operation. He had been killed while treating civilian casualties who had been caught in the crossfire between Task Force Obsidian and enemy forces. Despite orders to focus on the mission, Doc had insisted on providing medical care to wounded civilians, including children who had been injured when the fighting erupted in their village. A sniper's bullet had found Doc while he was working on a wounded child in what should have been a safe area. He had died instantly, but not before saving the lives of 3 civilians who would have otherwise perished from their injuries. His death had been a devastating blow to the unit, not just because of his medical skills, but because he represented the moral conscience of the team. The other names on Marcus's tattoo each carried similar stories of sacrifice and heroism that would never be officially recognized. Staff Sergeant Robert Tank Williams had died when he deliberately triggered an explosive charge that sealed a tunnel complex, preventing enemy forces from using it to attack civilian targets. His sacrifice had been crucial to the mission's success, but his family had been told he died in a vehicle accident during a routine patrol. Sergeant First Class Antonio Ace Rivera had been the team's communications specialist, responsible for maintaining contact with command and coordinating with other units when necessary. He had died when his communication post was targeted by enemy artillery, but not before he had successfully called in air support that saved the rest of the team from being overrun. Each name represented not just a fallen soldier, but a friend whose loss had fundamentally changed Marcus and the surviving members of Task Force Obsidian. The grief and survivor's guilt had been compounded by the classified nature of their deaths, which meant that their families never learned the true circumstances of how their loved ones had died or the heroic nature of their final actions. Marcus had struggled with the decision to get the tattoo for months after returning from the Balkan operation. Military regulations generally discouraged visible tattoos, and the specific content of what he was planning could potentially violate security protocols. But the weight of carrying his brother's memories without any visible acknowledgement of their sacrifice had become unbearable. The tattoo artist, Jake Morrison, had understood the significance of what Marcus was asking him to create. Jake had lost friends during his own military service and recognized the need that Marcus felt to create a permanent memorial to his fallen brothers. The sessions had been conducted in complete silence, with Jake working with the reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. Jake had suggested modifications to make the tattoo less obviously military in nature, but Marcus had insisted on accuracy. Every coordinate, every symbol, every name had to be exactly right because anything less would have dishonored the memories he was trying to preserve. The result was a work of art that was also a historical document, capturing details of operations that existed only in classified files and the memories of the men who had survived them. The conversation with Colonel Hayes had forced Marcus to confront the reality that his personal memorial had broader implications for national security. The coordinates tattooed on his arm weren't just geographical references, they were precise GPS locations that could potentially compromise future operations in those areas. The unit symbols weren't just artistic elements, they were specific identifiers that could reveal information about special operations capabilities and tactics. Marcus began to understand that his tattoo represented a fundamental tension between personal memory and professional obligation. His desire to honor his fallen brothers was legitimate and deeply personal, but it had to be balanced against his responsibility to protect classified information and maintain operational security for ongoing and future missions. The realization led him to examine other aspects of his military service and the ways in which special operations personnel dealt with the psychological challenges of classified service. Unlike conventional soldiers, special operations veterans couldn't share their stories with family members, write memoirs, or participate in public ceremonies that acknowledged their service and sacrifice. The isolation was compounded by the fact that many special operations missions were conducted in small units where the bonds between soldiers became intensely personal. Losing a brother in a conventional unit was devastating, but losing someone from a 12-man special operations team meant losing someone who had shared experiences that couldn't be discussed with anyone outside the unit. Marcus thought about the families of his fallen brothers and the incomplete stories they had been given about their loved ones' deaths. Danny's fiancée had been told he died in a training accident. Doc's parents believed he had been killed by a roadside bomb during a routine patrol. The official stories were necessary to protect classified operations, but they also meant that these families would never understand the heroic nature of how their sons had died. The weight of keeping these secrets had affected Marcus in ways he was only beginning to understand. The tattoo had been his attempt to create a private space where the truth could exist, even if it couldn't be shared. But Colonel Hayes had shown him that even private truths carried public responsibilities in the world of special operations. Marcus decided to take leave and visit Jake Morrison to discuss the situation. The tattoo shop was located in a strip mall near Fort Bragg, surrounded by businesses that catered to military personnel, uniform shops, surplus stores, and restaurants that served the kind of food that soldiers craved when they were off base. Jake was working on a client when Marcus arrived, carefully inking a Marine Corps emblem on the shoulder of a young soldier who looked like he had recently completed basic training. The contrast between the simple, regulation tattoo Jake was creating and the complex memorial that Marcus carried was striking. When Jake finished with his client, he invited Marcus into the back office where they could speak privately. The office walls were covered with photographs of tattoos Jake had created over the years, most of them military-themed designs that reflected the experiences and unit affiliations of his clients. "I heard through the grapevine that there might be some interest in your tattoo from official sources," Jake said without preamble. The military community was small and word traveled quickly when soldiers with classified backgrounds attracted attention from senior officers. Marcus described his encounter with Colonel Hayes, carefully avoiding any details that might compromise the security arrangements they had established. Jake listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as he recognized the implications of what Marcus was describing. "I've been thinking about your tattoo since the day we finished it," Jake admitted. "It's the most detailed memorial I've ever created, and I knew when we were working on it that it contained information that could be sensitive. I've been wondering if we should have made different choices about the level of detail." The conversation forced both men to confront the reality that Marcus's tattoo existed in a gray area between personal expression and security risk. Jake had the artistic skills to modify the tattoo, reducing its detail while preserving its memorial function. But any changes would alter the accuracy that Marcus had insisted upon when it was created. Marcus left the tattoo shop without making any immediate decisions about modifications, but with a better understanding of his options. He could have the tattoo altered to remove the most sensitive information while preserving its memorial function. He could have it completely removed and find other ways to honor his fallen brothers. Or he could continue to manage it as a security consideration while maintaining its current form. The decision would ultimately depend on his assessment of the risks and benefits of each option, but Marcus realized that the conversation with Colonel Hayes had fundamentally changed his relationship with the tattoo that had been his private memorial for 3 years. 6 months after his encounter with Colonel Hayes, Marcus received orders that would change everything. He was being transferred to a new assignment at the Pentagon, working in a classified analysis unit that evaluated special operations effectiveness and recommendations for future missions. The position would require the highest security clearances and regular interaction with senior military and intelligence officials. The transfer came with a personal message from Colonel Hayes, who had apparently recommended Marcus for the position based on their conversation during the inspection. The message was brief and professional, but it contained a subtle acknowledgement of their shared understanding about the complexities of classified service and personal memory. Marcus realized that the new position would make his tattoo an even greater security concern. Working in the Pentagon meant daily interactions with foreign military attaches, visiting officials, and intelligence personnel from allied nations. Any exposure of his tattoo in that environment could have far-reaching implications for ongoing operations and international relationships. The decision about what to do with his memorial had been weighing on him for months. He had consulted with Jake Morrison about modification options, spoken with a military chaplain about alternative ways to honor his fallen brothers, and researched the security protocols that would govern his new assignment. Every option involved trade-offs that he found difficult to accept. 2 weeks before his transfer date, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He arranged to meet with Colonel Hayes at the Pentagon, using his new position as justification for the meeting. He wanted to discuss not just his tattoo, but the broader issue of how special operations personnel dealt with the psychological challenges of classified service. Colonel Hayes had been promoted since their last meeting and now held a position in the Joint Chiefs of Staff that gave her oversight of special operations policy. Her office in the Pentagon was larger and more formal than the inspection room where they had first met, but Marcus noticed that she had maintained the same direct, no-nonsense approach that had characterized their previous interaction. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, gesturing for him to sit across from her desk. "I understand you have some concerns about your upcoming assignment and how it relates to our previous conversation." Her formal tone indicated that they were in an environment where every word needed to be carefully considered. Marcus had prepared for this conversation extensively, knowing that it could determine not just his military career but also how he would honor the memory of his fallen brothers for the rest of his life. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about our discussion regarding personal memorials and security considerations. I have a proposal that I believe addresses both concerns." Colonel Hayes leaned forward slightly, indicating her willingness to hear what Marcus had to say. Over the months since their first meeting, she had thought often about the soldier with the classified tattoo and the broader implications of how the military handled the personal needs of special operations personnel. "I want to establish a private memorial fund for the families of soldiers who die in classified operations," Marcus began. "The fund would provide scholarships and support services without revealing the specific circumstances of how these soldiers died. It would honor their memory while maintaining operational security." The proposal was ambitious and would require navigating complex legal and security considerations. But Colonel Hayes recognized the wisdom of what Marcus was suggesting. Special operations families often felt isolated by the classified nature of their loved one's service, and a support network could address some of the psychological challenges they faced. The tattoo would be modified to remove specific operational details while maintaining its memorial function, Marcus continued. Instead of coordinates and unit designations, it would contain only the names of the fallen and general symbols of military service. The detailed information would be transferred to a private memorial that would be maintained according to security protocols. Marcus had worked out the details with Jake Morrison, who had proposed a modification process that would preserve the artistic integrity of the tattoo while removing the most sensitive information. The names would remain, but the coordinates, unit symbols, and classified references would be replaced with more generic military imagery. Colonel Hayes considered the proposal carefully. It addressed the security concerns she had identified while preserving Marcus's ability to honor his fallen brothers. The Memorial Fund would provide a constructive outlet for his desire to commemorate their service while helping families who faced similar losses in the future. There are significant bureaucratic obstacles to establishing such a fund within the military system, Colonel Hayes observed. But there might be ways to work with existing military charities and veteran organizations to create something similar. Her response indicated that she was willing to explore the feasibility of Marcus's proposal. The conversation continued for over an hour as they discussed the practical and legal considerations involved in creating a memorial fund for families of soldiers who died in classified operations. Colonel Hayes had enough experience with military bureaucracy to understand the challenges they would face, but she also recognized the potential value of such an initiative. Marcus left the meeting with authorization to begin researching the legal and administrative requirements for establishing the memorial fund. Colonel Hayes had agreed to provide guidance and support through the process, recognizing that the initiative could serve as a model for addressing similar situations involving other special operations personnel. The modification of Marcus's tattoo was scheduled for the following week. Jake Morrison had developed a plan that would preserve the memorial aspects of the design while removing the specific operational details that posed security risks. The process would take several sessions and would result in a tattoo that maintained its emotional significance while eliminating its classification concerns. On the day of the first modification session, Marcus brought photographs of his fallen brothers and detailed biographical information that wasn't classified. Jake used this material to redesign elements of the tattoo, replacing operational symbols with personal details that honored each man's life rather than the circumstances of his death. Danny Martinez's section was redesigned to include imagery representing his love of photography, a hobby that had helped him develop the observational skills that made him such an effective reconnaissance specialist. Doc Patterson's memorial was modified to include medical symbols that honored his dedication to saving lives without revealing the classified nature of his final mission. The modification process was emotionally difficult for Marcus, as it required him to let go of the specific details that had connected him to his brother's final moments. But Jake's artistic skill ensured that the new design maintained the memorial's emotional power while addressing the security concerns that had been identified. The Memorial Fund proposal faced significant bureaucratic challenges, but Colonel Hayes' support helped navigate the administrative obstacles. Working with existing military charities, they developed a framework for providing support to families of soldiers who died in classified operations without revealing operational details or compromising security. The fund would provide educational scholarships for children of fallen special operations personnel, counseling services for families dealing with incomplete information about their loved ones' deaths, and support for widow and orphan benefits that address the unique challenges faced by families of classified service members. Marcus's new assignment at the Pentagon proved to be both professionally rewarding and personally healing. His experience with classified operations gave him unique insights into the effectiveness of special operations tactics and the human costs of covert missions. His recommendations for improving support services for special operations personnel and their families became part of official policy recommendations. 6 months after beginning his Pentagon assignment, Marcus received news that would have seemed impossible when he first got his tattoo. The families of Task Force Obsidian members would be receiving partial disclosure about the classified nature of their loved one's service. While specific operational details would remain classified, the families would be told that their sons had died heroically while serving in special operations missions that protected national security. The disclosure was part of a broader policy change that recognized the psychological needs of families who had lived with incomplete information about their loved ones' deaths. It wasn't complete truth, but it was a significant step toward acknowledging the service and sacrifice of soldiers who died in classified operations. Marcus was asked to participate in the notification process, providing families with what information could be safely shared about their son's service and sacrifice. It was an emotional experience that brought him face to face with the parents, siblings, and fiancés of the men whose names he had carried on his chest for years. Danny Martinez's parents wept when they learned that their son had died as a hero rather than in a routine training accident. Doc Patterson's mother expressed gratitude for finally understanding why her son had chosen Special Operations Service and why his death had seemed to affect his unit brothers so deeply. The Memorial Fund had grown beyond Marcus's original vision, providing support not just for families of Task Force Obsidian members but for hundreds of families across all branches of Special Operations. The fund's success demonstrated that there was a significant need for support services that acknowledged the unique challenges faced by families of soldiers who served in classified capacities. Marcus's modified tattoo had become a different kind of memorial, one that honored his fallen brothers while respecting the security requirements of his continued service. The names remained, positioned over his heart as a permanent reminder of their sacrifice. But the operational details had been replaced with personal symbols that celebrated their lives rather than documenting their deaths. The experience had taught Marcus that honoring the dead didn't require compromising the living. His fallen brother's memory could be preserved through actions that helped others rather than through artwork that potentially endangered ongoing operations. The Memorial Fund, the policy changes, and the family notifications had achieved more lasting honor for Task Force Obsidian than any tattoo ever could. Years later, when Marcus retired from military service, he continued to work with the Memorial Fund that had grown into a significant organization supporting special operations families. The fund had helped hundreds of families deal with the unique challenges of classified service and had become a model for similar organizations in other countries. Marcus never forgot the lesson learned during that inspection with Colonel Hayes. Personal memory and professional obligation didn't have to conflict if creative solutions were developed that honored both requirements. His tattoo had evolved from a security risk into a catalyst for changes that helped an entire community of families who had shared similar losses and challenges. The names remained on his chest, but they now represented something larger than personal grief. They had become symbols of service and sacrifice that inspired continued efforts to support others who faced similar challenges. In the end, the most fitting memorial for his fallen brothers wasn't the detailed artwork he had initially created, but the living legacy of support and recognition that grew from his willingness to transform a personal need into a broader solution. The silence that had filled the inspection room when Colonel Hayes first saw his tattoo had been broken by conversations that led to policy changes, family notifications, and support services that honored not just Task Force Obsidian but all special operations personnel who served in the shadows. The feared tattoo had become a force for positive change that extended far beyond what Marcus could have imagined when he first decided to carry his brothers' names on his heart.